The courtroom fell into a strange, almost eerie silence as the double oak doors creaked open. A boy, small, quiet, shoulders tucked beneath the oversized blazer of his late father, stepped inside, hand gripped tightly around a USB drive. He moved deliberately, each step echoing softly off the marble floor, a soft contrast to the hush that had overtaken the room. Murmurs from the spectators stilled, phones dropped from eye level, reporters paused their typing mid-sentence. There was something unexplainably commanding about him, something in his solemn eyes and the slow, focused way he made his way to the front row. He passed rows of murmuring spectators and hawk-eyed journalists until his small frame stopped beside a chair at the prosecution's side of the gallery. He climbed into the seat next to his court-appointed advocate, an overwhelmed junior attorney named Conrad Ellis, whose tie hung crooked and whose gaze darted nervously between the judge and the defense. His name was Jeremiah Clark, only 10 years old. But today, in front of a room filled with seasoned attorneys, television cameras peeking through slits in the blinds, and a judge whose name had been whispered in legal circles for decades, Jeremiah looked like the only adult in the building. Outside the courthouse, crowds had formed, some holding handmade signs bearing phrases like "Justice for Quincy," others capturing video clips that would circulate for hours online. The trial had already become a national conversation, a symbol of the crumbling faith the public had in justice, especially when the system stood accused of protecting its own. Quincy Clark, Jeremiah's father, had been a firefighter for 15 years. A decorated veteran of the force, he had pulled children from burning buildings, carried seniors to safety during floods, and once revived a man from cardiac arrest during a traffic jam by performing CPR on the roof of his own fire truck. His death, weeks ago, had been labeled a tragic and unforeseen incident during detainment. The official report noted cardiac arrest. Nothing more, nothing less. But a shaky, incomplete video uploaded by a local teen painted another version, one where Quincy could be heard gasping for breath while pinned under 3 officers. One of those officers had looked straight into the camera before the video cut out. That officer was Sergeant Kyle Rennick. His record was 22 complaints long, including use of excessive force, falsified reports, and verbal abuse. All sealed. Not one had resulted in a suspension longer than 3 days. His lawyers were relentless, well-funded by private donors with deep political connections. There were whispers about campaign contributions made to local officials, about meetings behind closed doors, about favors called in. And now, with the trial in full swing, the machinery of corruption had begun grinding the case to dust. Witnesses who had initially stepped forward began to shift their stories. First responders reported forgotten details. Surveillance footage that had once been promised simply couldn't be located. And worst of all, critical motions filed by the Clark family's attorneys were dismissed without reason by Judge Gerald Halderman, a figure whose connections to law enforcement ran so deep he had once written legal handbooks for precinct training. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of justice. It felt like a theater, one where the ending had already been written. Jeremiah wasn't supposed to be here. His uncle Marcus had fought to delay the trial. A retired Army intelligence officer with an eye for deception and an unshakable instinct for patterns, Marcus had uncovered files buried in layers of digital camouflage, video backups stored on municipal servers, phone logs, inconsistencies in timestamps. He had submitted a formal request for an extension, stating that new evidence could alter the outcome of the trial. The request was denied by Halderman without explanation. When Marcus protested outside the courthouse, a plainclothes officer warned him against interfering with proceedings. He knew what that meant. He had seen it before in war zones. When systems were rotten, truth was the first casualty. So they adjusted. Marcus handed the USB drive to Jeremiah. He didn't explain what was on it, only told him to keep it safe, to not let it go, to sit in that courtroom no matter what happened, and if he ever got the chance, to hand it to someone who could make a difference. Jeremiah hadn't asked questions. He had been quiet since the funeral, withdrawn. But the moment he slid that drive into his blazer pocket, he had stood a little straighter. As the judge rapped the gavel and the court resumed, the noise picked up again in hesitant trickles, papers shuffling, feet shifting, microphones crackling. The prosecution resumed cross-examination of the lead medical examiner, a man who looked everywhere but at the jury when answering. His tone was flat, clinical, devoid of the confidence he had displayed during the first week of the trial. He described Quincy's cause of death as inconclusive cardiac failure exacerbated by agitation. He paused frequently, often glancing toward the defense bench, where Sergeant Rennick sat beside his lawyers, arms crossed, face unreadable. Somewhere near the back, a journalist typed out the phrase, "reasonable doubt." It echoed in the minds of everyone watching. The defense had planted seeds, and now those seeds were beginning to grow into an ugly forest of ambiguity. The crowd outside had thinned since day one. Public interest had started to drift. The Clark family's legal team looked tired, battered by procedural setbacks and media spin. The judge refused to allow the leaked phone footage into evidence, calling it unverified and prejudicial. He refused to subpoena the arresting officer's full body cam logs. He refused to allow Marcus to testify, citing him as not directly involved in the event in question. And just like that, stone by stone, the truth was being bricked up behind legal barriers. Still, Jeremiah sat quietly, legs dangling above the floor. No one asked him why he was there. Few even noticed him, assuming he was a symbolic presence at best, a grieving child, nothing more. But every so often, his hand brushed the USB drive in his pocket, grounding him. He didn't understand the entire scope of the trial, but he understood enough. He understood that people were lying, that his father, who had kissed him on the forehead the morning he died and promised to bring back burgers after his shift, would never have resisted arrest. That Quincy Clark had never raised his voice in anger, never so much as cursed in front of Jeremiah. That a man like that didn't just collapse in the back of a police van. The courtroom may not have believed it. The officials and officers involved might never admit it. But Jeremiah knew, and Marcus knew, and buried deep in that USB drive, under folders disguised with random numbers, was the footage no one had seen yet, footage recovered from the precinct's discarded cloud server, data Marcus had decrypted after days of sleepless nights. It showed everything. Jeremiah glanced toward the bench where Judge Halderman sat, expression vacant, fingers tented together. The judge seemed to have aged a decade over the course of the trial, but it was not grief or guilt that wore on him. It was calculation. Halderman wasn't a fool. He knew which way the political winds were blowing. He knew that letting this trial implode would earn him favor among those in power, even if it cost him the public's trust. The scales in his mind balanced not justice, but loyalty. As cross-examination dragged on and the courtroom sank back into its tired rhythm, no one paid attention to the boy who hadn't moved. No one noticed the way his eyes flicked between the monitor on the prosecution's table and the USB in his lap. He was waiting. Marcus had told him the right moment would come, not before, not after. When the time came, he would know. And then, perhaps, everything would change. 2 weeks before the trial resumed, the Clark family home was quiet, its silence held together by the weight of grief. Down in the basement, dust swirled in the dim shaft of light from a single exposed bulb. Marcus Clark stood hunched over an old work table, his fingers stiff from hours of meticulous repair. Quincy's laptop, once water-damaged and left for dead after the chaos of his arrest, now sat open like a cracked puzzle. The screen flickered with uncertainty, each spark of life fighting through corrupted files and fragmented directories. Marcus, a retired Army intelligence officer, had handled encrypted drives and scrambled code in hostile zones overseas, but nothing had prepared him for this. This was personal. Days passed with minimal progress. He barely left the basement, fueled by black coffee and a gnawing sense of duty. He retraced old logins, reconstructed broken file paths, and navigated through half-rendered folders. Quincy had always been meticulous, the kind of man who backed up his backup. But most of it was gone, until Marcus stumbled upon something buried deeper than the rest, a file folder oddly named Insurance. At first it wouldn't open. Then, like a lock giving way under the right pressure, it unfolded. Inside were files that made Marcus's stomach knot. Dozens of voice memos with dates that matched incidents Quincy had quietly mentioned over family dinners. There were grainy videos, mostly filmed at odd angles as if the camera was hidden, audio logs layered with ambient sounds of traffic stops, dispatch chatter, and clipped, tense exchanges between officers. Quincy hadn't just been a firefighter. He'd been a watchdog. A reluctant one maybe, but deliberate. He'd been documenting everything. Racial profiling patterns, inconsistencies in arrest reports, and private conversations with officers he trusted less and less. Each file Marcus played hit harder than the last. Some were heartbreaking. A tired Quincy reflecting on how differently he was treated in uniform compared to out of it. Others were enraging. Audio of officers mocking victims, bragging about planted evidence, laughing at disciplinary loopholes. But the most damning was a file that didn't even have a title, just a timestamp. It was from the night of Quincy's arrest. The laptop, still unstable, crashed every few minutes. Marcus was about to restart it again when small footsteps creaked down the stairs. Jeremiah, clad in his school hoodie, peered around the corner. He didn't ask if he could help. He just sat beside his uncle and stared at the screen. After a moment, his fingers moved, tapping the spacebar. The file opened. What they saw didn't need explanation. It was a static security feed, grainy but clear enough to recognize faces. Quincy stood cuffed in a precinct hallway, shoulders slumped but not resisting. Sergeant Rennick entered the frame with 3 other officers. No warning, no escalation. Rennick grabbed Quincy by the collar and slammed his head into the wall with such force that he crumpled instantly. Laughter echoed faintly from the others. No one intervened. No one called for medical aid. Jeremiah stared in silence, his voice barely a whisper when he finally spoke. He remembered that night. His father had knelt in front of him before the police came, saying if anything ever happened, he should go to Uncle Marcus. He remembered his father's words exactly. The truth will always fight its way out. Marcus copied the file onto a USB drive, then again onto a second and a third. He sent encrypted versions to 3 independent media outlets. Only one responded, a small but relentless journalist named Tasha Mayfield who had a reputation for chasing buried stories. She confirmed she would run it within days. But 3 days later, she was arrested on charges the Clark family had never heard of, and her publication issued a vague statement about internal investigations. The footage never saw daylight. Meanwhile, the courtroom turned colder. The prosecution, once led by Aaron Duvall, a young lawyer with fire in his veins, was suddenly handed over to a man named Gregory Voss. Voss had no public interest background, but plenty of photographs attending galas with the mayor and golfing with precinct officials. Motions that once brought murmurs of promise were now struck down without explanation. Media outlets were restricted. Protesters were corralled and arrested. The judge seemed more invested in keeping order than uncovering the truth. And still, Marcus waited. Waited for a break, a window, a single moment where the footage could matter. That moment came not from the judge, nor from the prosecution. It came from a boy who had just turned 10. On the second day of trial, after hours of back-and-forth testimony that sounded increasingly sanitized, Jeremiah sat through it all, blazer sleeves slipping past his wrists, eyes fixed forward. The court prepared to recess. Lawyers packed folders. Jurors exhaled. But Jeremiah stood. Without a word, he walked past the gallery railing, down the center aisle, and stepped into open court. The bailiff moved immediately, unsure if he should stop him. The judge raised his gavel to restore order, but Jeremiah didn't flinch. He lifted the USB in his hand like it was a torch, not a file. He told the court there was something they hadn't seen. He didn't ask them to believe him. He just asked them to play it. A long pause followed. The judge's eyes darted to the prosecution, to the defense, then back to Jeremiah. He slammed the gavel and barked about decorum. But the courtroom wasn't listening to him anymore. The prosecution looked stunned. Members of the jury whispered to each other, and on the monitor near the clerk's desk, the screen lit up. The video played. Gasps broke out almost instantly. A woman in the back row covered her mouth. One of the jurors rose halfway to his feet before remembering where he was. The footage left no room for interpretation. Quincy had not resisted. He had not threatened anyone. He had been beaten. Brutally, deliberately, and then left. The prosecution scrambled. Voss, suddenly animated, moved to enter the footage into evidence. The defense objected, but the room was no longer under anyone's control. Reporters were already live tweeting. Phones buzzed with alerts. Outside the courthouse, news trucks reoriented their cameras. Judge Halderman, for the first time, looked shaken. His voice cracked as he called for an emergency recess, gavel pounding with a desperation that cracked the handle. Within hours, his court email was deactivated. His chambers issued no statements, and by morning, he had vanished from public sight. But the battle was far from over. That night, Marcus didn't sleep. He paced the house like a soldier expecting an ambush. Jeremiah, exhausted but quiet, sat in the living room, watching news anchors try to make sense of what had just unfolded. Headlines screamed across screens. 10-year-old drops bombshell evidence in brutality case. Sergeant on trial after shocking courtroom reveal. The footage had been shared, reposted, analyzed, and verified by forensic experts. But with the court recessed and the city scrambling to recover, the family knew the fight had only entered a new phase. Quincy's death was no longer a whisper in forgotten files. It was a roaring call for accountability, louder than ever. And at the center of it all stood a boy with trembling hands and a USB drive, who had reminded a city that truth, even when buried, never forgets how to rise. The next morning, the courtroom was quieter than usual, but not from peace, more like the hush before a storm. Murmurs replaced the usual shuffle of chairs and clatter of documents. Jeremiah's absence was like a silent alarm. His seat on the front bench sat empty, a folded sweater in its place. Speculation raced through the gallery. Some whispered that he had been taken into protective custody. Others murmured darker things, that he was being silenced, sent away, perhaps even threatened into disappearing. A few swore they'd seen unmarked black cars circling Marcus's home that morning. No one had answers, and the silence only fed the fear. But just before the judge entered, the side door creaked open, and Marcus Clark stepped into the courtroom. He moved with deliberate purpose, head high, face drawn with exhaustion but sharp with defiance. In his hand, a manila folder sealed with a red tab. He ignored the stares, the curious glances from reporters and court staff, and marched straight to the clerk's desk. He handed over the folder, an affidavit signed under penalty of perjury, confirming the discovery of the USB drive and its chain of custody. Along with it, a motion. He was requesting the court officially admit the video as newly discovered evidence. Judge Halderman entered moments later, robe flowing, gavel tight in hand, eyes scanning the courtroom with icy precision. When informed of the motion, his jaw clenched. His response was immediate, mechanical. He questioned the authenticity of the evidence, its relevance, and the timing of its release. But it was too late. The video had detonated across the world like a shockwave. Within hours of its release, the footage had gone viral. What started as a blurry screen capture shared by an anonymous Twitter account had exploded across every major platform. The brutality was undeniable. Quincy's body, bloodied and limp, the officers around him grinning with impunity. This wasn't just damning. It was systemic. It was a mirror held up to every injustice the public had suspected, but never seen with such clarity. International news outlets ran with it. BBC, Al Jazeera, Der Spiegel, all carried Quincy's name. Commentators in London debated it alongside other abuses of state power. Protesters in Paris chanted his name. In South Africa, a college class held a moment of silence in solidarity. America, for all its flags and pledges, had once again exposed a wound it refused to heal. Then came the statements. Congressional representatives issued carefully worded remarks, calling for investigations and transparency. Some were genuine. Others rang hollow, especially from those with past records of voting against police oversight. One representative broke down in tears during a press conference, recounting how her own brother had faced similar abuse but never lived to tell the story. Her voice cracked, and the nation listened. But perhaps more powerful than the politicians were the whistleblowers. First came a retired detective, John Bellamy, who had served in the same department as Sergeant Rennick years ago. He revealed that he'd once filed a complaint warning superiors about Rennick's escalating behavior, the unnecessary force, the slurs muttered under his breath, the way he toyed with suspects like it was a sport. Bellamy had been silenced, forced into early retirement under the weight of non-disclosure agreements and veiled threats to his pension. But after seeing the footage, after seeing Jeremiah's trembling hand hold up that USB like a torch in the dark, Bellamy stepped forward. His voice, too, joined the growing chorus. Still the courtroom resisted. The bench pushed back like a cornered animal. Motions to suppress the evidence were filed within the hour. Objections came not just from the defense but from court officials themselves. The bailiff conferred privately with the judge more than once. At one point, the power flickered in the courtroom, causing a brief suspension of proceedings. Rumors of cyber attacks, sabotage, and administrative tampering filled the hallways. Then came the federal marshal. Tall, composed, and dressed in a plain suit, he arrived during a recess and handed the judge a sealed envelope. The contents were not immediately revealed, but it was clear the message wasn't routine. The marshal stated that Judge Halderman was under review for potential conflict of interest, a claim stemming from his undisclosed meetings with legal counsel connected to Rennick's defense. The judge, visibly rattled but trying not to show it, pushed back. He refused to recuse himself, claiming the allegations were politically motivated. But the tension in the room was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the name Senator Travis Cole began to circulate like wildfire. The same senator who had once decried Quincy as a rogue officer undone by poor choices now found himself the subject of leaked emails. A former staffer dropped a series of documents to an independent journalist, emails showing that Cole had advocated behind closed doors for Quincy's arrest to be buried to protect political optics. The senator had called the case a tragic misunderstanding blown out of proportion in a recent press conference. Now, the truth was out. He wasn't protecting the public. He was protecting votes. Halderman, perhaps sensing the scales shifting, made a final push to regain control. He ruled that the court would skip re-examinations of witnesses, citing a need to streamline proceedings due to public pressure and judicial efficiency. The statement barely veiled his intent. The courtroom reacted with stunned silence. Skipping witness re-examinations meant suppressing the ripple effect of the video, stalling the truth before it reached the jury's ears again. It was a move of desperation masquerading as law. Then, just as the court was about to transition into closing arguments, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the chamber burst open. All heads turned, cameras flashed, gasps broke through the quiet. Aaron Duvall, the original prosecutor, strode into the room with a briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes rimmed with fatigue, but there was steel in his spine. He didn't wait to be acknowledged. He marched to the center aisle and lifted his voice, calm but forceful. He declared that he had been removed from the case under false pretenses, that key pieces of evidence had been withheld, that internal memos showed deliberate tampering with witness testimonies. In his briefcase, he carried documents, emails, signed statements, case files that had vanished from the prosecution's records days after his dismissal. He demanded a federal review for prosecutorial misconduct. Chaos erupted. Reporters raced to capture every word. Phones buzzed with instant uploads. The gallery exploded into shouts of disbelief and support. Halderman tried to gavel them down, but the noise swallowed him. Even the jury flinched at the volume, their stoic expressions finally cracking under the weight of what was unfolding. With the courtroom in disarray, Halderman had no choice. He called a recess, not just for the hour, but indefinitely, pending a review of the new claims. The case, once a tightly controlled puppet show, was unraveling at its seams. Outside, the courthouse grounds had transformed. Houses stood shoulder to shoulder, not just for Quincy, but for the countless others whose names had never trended. The crowd pulsed with grief, with fury, with something louder than anger, resolve. Hand-painted signs stretched high. Justice for Quincy, we see you, this stops now. Faces of all ages and colors blended into a single voice. They didn't chant for vengeance, they chanted for truth. And in the center of it all, carried on a handmade banner, was a photo of Jeremiah. Not a staged portrait, not a school photo, but a candid shot someone had taken in court the day he stood with that USB, eyes wide, jaw firm, fear in his bones, but fire in his stance. He had become a symbol not of martyrdom, but of bravery, of a child who dared to walk through fear with nothing but truth in his pocket. In newsrooms and university classrooms, in households and churches, people spoke of him. Not as a hero from legend, but as a real boy, 10 years old, small in stature, towering in courage. They debated the legality of his actions, the ethics of allowing a child into the courtroom arena, but no one questioned the impact. This time they had a face, a name, a boy, not a statistic, not a case number. And that changed everything. 3 days later, as the pale light of dawn stretched across the city skyline, the courthouse stirred with a solemn energy. Lines of people wrapped around the building, faces tense, voices low, as if the weight of history hung in the chilled morning air. News vans were parked shoulder to shoulder, their satellite dishes stretching skyward like anxious hands. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with restrained anticipation, cameras restricted but pens ready, and for the first time since the trial began, a shift in tone could be felt, an unspoken understanding that something irreversible was about to unfold. The bench was no longer occupied by Judge Halderman. Mounting public pressure, ethical complaints, and a formal petition from the State Bar Association had led to his quiet removal. In his place stood Magistrate Evelyn Moreno, flown in from an adjacent federal district and known for her intolerance of corruption and procedural shortcuts. She took her seat without fanfare, her eyes scanning the packed room with a mix of composure and resolve. Unlike her predecessor, she wasted no time. The moment the court was called to order, Aaron Duval stepped forward. He no longer wore the somber detachment of a sidelined prosecutor. His presence now was calculated and steady, like a man who had wrestled with guilt and come out the other side armed with facts. With the court's permission, he laid out his case. It began slowly. A single complaint suppressed at the precinct level. Then another, this time from a Navy doctor who claimed a pattern of harassment toward black servicemen stationed at Quantico. The evidence snowballed. Witnesses who had been labeled unreliable were found to have received anonymous deposits and, in some cases, state-funded job offers to relocate. Phone records surfaced, showing late-night calls between Rennick's defense team and 2 sitting members of the local judiciary. Then came the forensic audit of the precinct's hard drives, initiated in response to the USB video. What the inquiry revealed stunned even seasoned litigators. Years of body cam footage had been archived under false metadata. Files labeled as routine traffic stops were, in fact, disturbing encounters, many involving young black men in uniform. Quincy Carter's name appeared in several redacted documents that, when decrypted, outlined an informal flag list used internally to mark agitators within the military ranks. Most were black. All had filed complaints. Quincy had found the list. According to emails recovered from his personal inbox, he had tried to send the information to an investigative journalist in D.C. The email was never delivered. Authorities had ruled his death a tragic altercation gone wrong, but the chain of evidence now pointed to a premeditated silencing. As Duval pieced it all together, the room remained breathless. Every revelation landed like a gavel strike. One by one, faces in the courtroom tightened. Jurors, clerks, reporters. Even the court stenographer seemed to pause at times, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of what was being said. By mid-afternoon, Duval rested his case. No defense argument was offered. Rennick's attorney sat stone-faced, hands folded, while Rennick himself looked down, his usual air of indifference cracked by something raw, fear perhaps, or the realization that he could no longer outrun the truth. The jury received instructions that evening. 12 citizens, now tasked with deciding the fate of a man who had come to symbolize not just a singular act of violence, but a system-wide betrayal. They deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, silence blanketed the room. The foreman, a middle-aged postal worker who hadn't spoken much during the trial, stood and held the verdict sheet with a tremble in his hands. Guilty, on all counts. The first sound was a gasp, then the murmurs, then the tears. Inside, people hugged one another, hands over mouths, eyes lifted as if daring to believe justice had actually found a home here. Reporters rushed out the side doors, phones already pressed to ears, ready to deliver the headline that would ricochet around the world. Outside, the crowd erupted. Not in violence, but in catharsis. Flags were raised. Signs with Quincy's face painted in bold colors waved above the heads of strangers who now stood shoulder to shoulder, not just for him, but for all the names that had never reached a courtroom. The ground felt different, firm, like it had been reclaimed by something righteous. Senator Travis Cole's office released a statement moments later. It was vague, deflective, calling the verdict an important moment for the judicial process. But within hours, leaked emails from the Ethics Committee confirmed he would face a formal inquiry for interfering with a federal case. Judge Halderman submitted his resignation quietly, citing health concerns, though no one believed it. And Sergeant Kyle Rennick, who once strutted into court flanked by attorneys and false confidence, was led away in cuffs, shackled by the very system he had once manipulated. But not everyone stayed for the aftermath. Jeremiah Carter, the 10-year-old boy whose bravery had cracked open the silence, didn't seek cameras or applause. He slipped out a side entrance with Marcus, unnoticed by most. They found a spot at the back of the courthouse steps, the same steps Quincy had once climbed in his dress uniform, full of hope. They sat quietly, the morning sun climbing higher above the horizon, casting long golden beams across the concrete. Marcus watched the boy beside him, his posture quiet but not fragile, his eyes fixed on something far off. Maybe memory, maybe what came next. The older man whispered that he'd done it, that he'd changed everything. But Jeremiah only shook his head. He said it wasn't him, it was his dad. He'd just listened. And somehow, that made the moment heavier. Not because it diminished Jeremiah's role, but because it illuminated something larger, a truth so profound it echoed beyond words. The story was never about a courtroom, or even a single crime. It was about a boy who dared to believe his father's voice mattered, who stood against a machine designed to grind people down and offered it something it couldn't process, unwavering truth. The nation would remember this day, not just in headlines or hashtags, but in laws re-examined, in conversations reopened, in systems forced to account for what they had buried. The name Quincy Carter would no longer be a footnote or a face on a mural. It would be a lesson, a reckoning, a flame that kept burning. And for once, in the chambers where justice had so often been diluted or delayed, the echo that lingered wasn't the sound of gavel or gloat. It was the steady, unwavering voice of a child, clear, honest, and unafraid.